A siren died down the block before anyone understood why, followed by a silence that carried the shape of something falling through a city designed not to fall. And when the traffic lights winked out, the first cars stalled mid-turn like actors waiting for their cue. People shouted, glass chimed, and a strip of downtown shuddered as if an invisible hand had tested its elasticity and decided it would not comply, while emergency broadcasts looped fragments of instruction that the power refused to finish. In the middle of the chaos, a bald man in a yellow shirt stood under a flickering billboard and checked his nails as building alarms tried and failed to name what was happening around him. Machines that had always read strength now offered nonsense, and men in suits with access to every sensors in the city began assigning blame to equipment instead of what moved in front of them. This is only the beginning. What you just heard is a single, small fracture in a system that will not hold, and worse is coming. You're about to hear how Guardians collapse and systems fail. Subscribe once now so you don't miss what's coming, because this is a warning, not an invitation, and what follows will have consequences that won't be undone by the heroes you trust. The first sign that something had gone wrong was not a villain attack or a collapsing tower, but a response failure that no one could explain when a subway derailment downtown triggered an emergency call that should have been routine for the 7. Dispatch marked the situation as a structural hazard, localized, manageable, and within the capacity of any one of Vought's public heroes to resolve before it made the morning cycle. Homelander's route was cleared, Maeve's backup flight path was confirmed, and A-Train's intercept was scheduled to secure the perimeter. But when the rescue footage began streaming back, the narrative fractured in a way the brand team had never rehearsed. People trapped beneath twisted metal were already being lifted clear by someone who did not wear a logo, and the cameras that arrived expecting a save found a bald man in a yellow suit casually moving debris aside as if he were looking for something he had dropped. He did not hurry because nothing in the situation appeared to require it, and the section of collapsed tunnel that should have resisted any civilian attempt at access parted with a sound that did not match the force being applied. A rescue worker shouted for space as he reached into the wreckage and drew out a passenger with the same care one might use to retrieve groceries from a shelf, while the emergency lights overhead flickered as if confused about what to illuminate. When Homelander landed at the street-level access point, he found the extraction already in progress and the crowd's attention drifting away from the sky to the man who had arrived on foot. The cameras pivoted with them, and the angle that usually framed a hero in control now included someone who did not appear to understand why the scene had stopped to watch him. Inside the tunnel, Saitama paused to ask whether anyone had seen a plastic bag, because he thought he might have dropped his coupon when the train had hit, and the request was recorded on 3 separate microphones that had been intended to capture instructions. Maeve reached the breach and took in the sight of a support beam that had been lifted free without buckling the surrounding frame, and the engineer beside her admitted that the load path should have shifted catastrophically if anyone had attempted that without equipment. A train arrived with the expectation of securing victims and found that the only thing left to secure was a man who was brushing dust from his cape with mild annoyance. When Saitama asked if the nearest supermarket would still be open after this, the question carried through a tunnel that had already been cleared. On the surface, Ashley Barrett watched the live feed and asked why the public was not cheering the person they had been trained to cheer, and the silence that followed was less about confusion than about a camera that could not find a familiar frame. The brand overlay that normally tracked Homelander's movements lagged behind him, because the focus had shifted to someone who was not part of the system that made sense of events. Dispatch attempted to credit the rescue to a coordinated response, but the timestamps refused to align with the 7's arrival, and the legal team began drafting language that would reframe assistance as partnership. In the tunnel, a child asked Saitama if he was a hero, and he replied that he was just helping because it would be faster. Homelander stepped forward with the calm assurance that had always returned the story to its intended shape, and thanked Saitama for assisting before instructing the remaining crews to stand clear. The last section of wreckage shifted as Saitama lifted it with one hand to check for anyone trapped beneath, and the overhead lights dimmed for a moment, as if the grid had registered a load it could not categorize. Maeve noticed that the steel had bent without the sound of strain, and the engineer beside her began to say something about tolerances before deciding not to finish. A train reported that the perimeter was secure, but the crowd's phones remained pointed at someone who did not wear a cape that meant anything to them. When the final victim was brought out, the applause that followed was diffuse and uncertain, because the cameras could not decide where to rest. Saitama asked again about the supermarket as emergency crews moved past him, and a responder pointed toward an exit that would take him back to the street. Homelander watched him go with a look that did not translate well on live broadcast, and Ashley requested an immediate post-incident briefing to address what the audience had just seen. Outside, the news choppers circled a scene that had already been resolved, and the story that should have begun with a save was now beginning with a question. The official statement was released before the dust had settled in the tunnel, because Vought's communications team understood that narrative moved faster than rescue vehicles, and the first version described the incident as a coordinated response led by Homelander with assistance from a concerned civilian. The problem was that the footage circulating online did not support the wording, and the clips that trended were not of a branded landing, but of a man in a yellow suit lifting a support beam without changing his expression. A train watched one of the uploads loop on a monitor and noted that the steel had not screamed the way it should have, while Maeve asked whether the engineer's comment about tolerances had made it into any of the public reports. Ashley insisted that attribution could be corrected in post-incident coverage, and scheduled a press appearance that would reposition the save as a joint effort. On the way to the exit, Saitama stopped at a vending machine that had been knocked against the wall and straightened it because it looked like it might fall on someone, and the action was captured by a phone that had been recording since the derailment. The machine did not rattle when it settled, and the person filming said thank you in a voice that did not recognize the significance of what they had just seen. When Saitama asked whether this was the street that led to the supermarket, a responder pointed him toward daylight with the distracted certainty of someone triaging larger problems. He stepped out into a crowd that had already begun to treat the event as resolved, and no one stopped him because there was nothing to contain. The second emergency arrived before the press conference could begin, because a structural failure in a nearby office tower triggered an evacuation that would normally have been routed to Vought as a demonstration of preparedness. Homelander redirected from the briefing room with a smile that cameras understood, and Maeve followed with the expectation that this time the save would begin on their terms. A train moved to secure the perimeter, clearing a path through traffic that had begun to stall under conflicting signals from lights that could not decide whether to hold or yield. When the first section of facade peeled away from the upper floors, the crowd gasped in a rhythm that matched the movement of phones rising to record. Inside the building, a maintenance worker had become trapped between a jammed service door and a load-bearing column that had shifted during the failure, and the gap was too narrow for standard equipment. Homelander forced the door with a practiced motion that cameras could frame, but the column leaned as if it had been persuaded by something other than force. The worker shouted as dust fell from a ceiling that had not yet decided to come down, and Maeve braced against the frame to keep the opening from collapsing. A train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as bystanders pushed closer for a view. Saitama arrived because the supermarket had been closed off by the evacuation, and he was looking for another route, and he paused when he saw the maintenance worker pinned by the column. He asked if they needed help in the same tone he had used in the tunnel, and Maeve glanced over with a brief nod that did not consider the implications. When he stepped forward and placed a hand on the column to steady it, The dust that had been falling stopped as if the air had decided to wait. Homelander noticed the change in load before the sensors did, and the door that had resisted him a moment ago swung open with less effort than it had taken to start. The worker slid free with a gasp, and Maeve eased the frame back into place while emergency crews moved in with stretchers. A train reported that the crowd had surged again, but this time the phones were not pointed at the sky. Ashley's earpiece crackled with a request to clarify why an unaffiliated civilian appeared in 2 separate saves within an hour, and Legal began drafting language that would define assistance as an extension of Vought's mandate. Homelander thanked Saitama for the help with a smile that cameras could read, and Saitama asked whether the supermarket around the corner might still be open. Outside, the facade continued to shift as engineers assessed whether the building could be stabilized, and the news choppers framed the 7 against a skyline that no longer belonged entirely to them. The press conference was delayed while the feeds filled with clips that could not be attributed to branding, and the question of relevance began to circulate in comment sections that Vought did not control. Saitama turned down the street in search of an open store, and the cameras followed him longer than they had followed any of the heroes that day. By the time the delayed press conference finally went live, the story had already escaped the structure Vought normally imposed on it, because the clips circulating across every major platform showed a pattern that branding could not easily absorb into a partnership narrative. 2 separate rescues, both resolved before the 7 could establish control, both featuring the same unaffiliated civilian whose name no one in the system had on file. Ashley Barrett stood behind the podium with language prepared to credit Homelander's leadership and Maeve's coordination, but the questions from reporters did not ask about response times or training protocols, and instead focused on whether Vought had authorized a new hero whose presence seemed to preempt their own. Legal signaled for deflection. Public relations requested a pivot to safety messaging, and the live feed displayed Saitama walking past a storefront that had already pulled its shutters. Inside the tower, a task group was assembled with instructions to identify the civilian and determine whether he could be brought under contract before the narrative hardened into something less manageable. The analytics team ran facial recognition against every public database they were licensed to access, and returned no confirmed matches, which was unusual in a city where anonymity rarely survived an afternoon. A train watched the feed from a secure terminal and commented that the man did not move like someone trying to be seen, while Maeve asked whether anyone had considered that he might not be interested. Ashley dismissed the question because interest had never been a prerequisite for affiliation when the alternative was irrelevance. The first attempt at outreach took the form of an invitation delivered by a liaison who had been trained to present opportunity as inevitability, and he found Saitama in a discount aisle comparing instant noodles with a concentration that suggested the choice mattered more than the sirens outside. The liaison explained Vought's role in coordinating public safety and offered expedited registration, media support, and a stipend that would remove the need for coupon clipping. Saitama asked whether the registration would take long because he had already missed the sale on eggs, and the liaison assured him that the process could be completed in under an hour. When Saitama declined on the grounds that paperwork was a hassle, the liaison requested a meeting at a time that would be more convenient. Upstairs, Homelander reviewed the outreach report with a calm that marketing had taught the public to read as confidence, and asked whether inconvenience had been addressed as a barrier to entry. Ashley authorized a second attempt with the addition of a transport that would reduce travel time, and Legal prepared a provisional agreement that defined affiliation in terms broad enough to capture assistance after the fact. Maeve noted that the footage from the office tower was trending without brand attribution, and the analytics team reported a dip in sentiment that could not be corrected through ad placement. A train asked whether the public understood what they were seeing, and Ashley replied that understanding was less important than framing. While the invitation was being redrafted, A third emergency triggered across town when a gas main ruptured beneath a residential block, and the evacuation protocols routed the situation to the 7 with priority status. Homelander departed with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to re-establish the familiar sequence of arrival, command, and resolution, while Maeve coordinated with first responders to secure the perimeter. A train cleared traffic along a route that had begun to desynchronize under conflicting signals, and the brand team prepared overlays that would track the save in real time. Saitama arrived because the supermarket he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a resident struggling to move an elderly neighbor away from a sagging doorway. He asked if they needed help in the same tone he had used before, and when they nodded, he lifted the frame enough to clear the path without comment. The gas hissed from a fissure that engineers would later say should have collapsed the street, and the crowd's attention shifted in a way that did not wait for a landing. When Homelander touched down seconds later, the first person he saw was the same man setting a door aside as if it were an inconvenience. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed began to favor an unaffiliated presence for the 3rd time that day, and Legal's provisional agreement was revised to include emergency designation without consent. The analytics team reported a second dip in sentiment that no amount of framing could offset, and the phrase, overnight, began to appear in headlines that Vought did not control. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a responder pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. The emergency designation was pushed through as a temporary measure that Legal assured would preserve operational clarity, but the public version of the move arrived as a notification that Vought had added an unregistered responder to its citywide safety framework. The problem was that the footage accompanying the announcement did not show onboarding or coordination, and instead compiled 3 separate incidents in which Saitama appeared before the 7 had established command. News anchors attempted to describe the sequence as collaboration, while the on-screen timelines refused to align, and the analytics dashboard in Ashley's office began to register a pattern that had never been seen outside of a scandal. Homelander watched a replay of the gas main rescue with a stillness that the brand team would later describe as contemplative. Across Midtown, traffic control systems entered a fallback mode when the evacuation routes from the ruptured main conflicted with the perimeter established for a separate structural alert, and the city's incident command requested Vought's assistance in resolving the overlap. Maeve coordinated with first responders to reroute foot traffic through a plaza that had not been designed for that volume, and A-Train reported that the surge was moving faster than the barriers could be deployed. The plaza's overhead signage flickered as if unsure which instruction to prioritize, and a line of storefronts pulled their shutters when the gas smell reached the street. Saitama arrived because the route he had been given toward an open market intersected with the redirected crowd, and he paused when he saw a delivery truck tipped against a support column that had begun to crack under the load. A responder shouted for distance as the column shifted again, and the driver inside the cab tried to free himself from a seatbelt that had jammed during the impact. Saitama asked whether they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, placing a hand against the truck to keep it from sliding further. The crack in the column did not widen when the weight shifted, and the dust that had been falling settled without reaching the ground. Maeve noticed the change before the sensors did and moved to secure the opening while emergency crews cut the driver free, and the plaza's crowd pressed closer despite the shouted warnings. A train reported that the barriers had failed to hold when bystanders pushed for a view, and the phones that rose were not pointed toward the sky. Homelander arrived with the calm assurance that had always returned the story to its intended shape, and thanked Saitama for assisting before instructing the crowd to move back. The cameras followed the instruction, and then drifted toward the man who had already stepped away to ask about the nearest open store. Upstairs, Ashley authorized a citywide messaging package that would emphasize coordination and shared responsibility, and the brand team prepared a segment that would feature Homelander alongside the new responder. Legal finalized the emergency designation with language that implied consent through action, and the analytics team reported a further dip in sentiment that correlated with each clip of Saitama acting independently. The mayor's office requested clarification on whether Vought's new addition would be taking lead on future incidents, and the question circulated in a briefing room that had never needed to ask it. While the messaging package was being assembled, a transformer failure on the west side triggered a localized outage that spread into adjacent blocks when backup systems failed to synchronize. The city's grid operator requested immediate assistance when elevators began to stall between floors, and the fire department reported residents trapped in stairwells where emergency lighting had not engaged. Maeve redirected to a residential tower where an upper-floor landing had buckled under the strain, and A-Train moved to secure a route through traffic that no longer obeyed the lights. Saitama arrived because the street he had taken in search of an open market ran past the tower, and he paused when he saw a family trying to move a mattress down a stairwell that had tilted. He asked if they needed help and lifted the frame enough to clear the obstruction without comment, and the landing settled back into place with a sound that did not match the force applied. The crowd's attention shifted again, and the phones that had been pointed toward the stairwell did not turn away when Homelander landed behind him. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence for the fourth time that afternoon, and the messaging package was revised to include language that defined leadership as facilitation. The analytics team reported a sentiment drop that could not be offset through placement, and the word irrelevant appeared in a headline that legal requested be challenged. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the outage might still be open, and a responder pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. By late afternoon, the narrative had shifted from response times to jurisdiction, because the fourth independent save in as many hours had prompted the mayor's office to request a formal clarification on who, exactly, was responsible for coordinating large-scale emergencies when an unaffiliated civilian kept arriving first. Vought's legal team framed the emergency designation as sufficient to establish operational authority, but the footage circulating across national networks did not show coordination so much as coincidence that favored the same person every time. Ashley authorized a joint statement with municipal leadership that would emphasize partnership, while privately requesting a federal liaison to advise on whether temporary powers could be extended to incorporate Saitama without his signature. Homelander reviewed the draft and asked whether the public would accept leadership that followed rather than led. The liaison arrived with a briefing that treated the day's incidents as a statistical anomaly until a fifth alert triggered at a freight yard on the riverfront, where a chemical tanker had jackknifed and ruptured its containment. The plume that rose from the spill carried a hazard classification that rooted the response to both Vought and federal oversight, and a perimeter was established that extended into a residential block. Maeve coordinated with hazmat crews to evacuate the nearest buildings, and A-Train cleared a path for emergency vehicles through traffic that had begun to gridlock under conflicting signals. The wind shifted as the first containment tents were erected, and a line of residents pressed against a barrier that had not been designed for panic. Saitama arrived because the route toward an open market intersected with the freight yard, and he paused when he saw a forklift operator trying to free a coworker pinned beneath a pallet that had slid during the crash. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, lifting the pallet enough to clear the man's leg without comment. The coworker was moved to a stretcher as hazmat crews shouted for distance, and the plume that had been drifting toward the residential block hesitated, as if reconsidering its path. When Homelander landed seconds later, the first person he saw was the same man stepping back to ask whether the market down the street might still be open. The federal liaison watched the live feed from a command vehicle, and noted that the hazard sensors had registered a pressure change that did not correspond to any deployed equipment. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the national networks cut to footage that favored an unaffiliated presence for the fifth time, and legal began drafting language that would redefine assistance as a federalized extension of Vought's mandate. Maeve reported that the perimeter was holding, but the residents' phones remained pointed at someone who had already turned away from the spill. In the tower, the analytics team projected a sentiment curve that dipped below any threshold previously associated with brand resilience, and the liaison recommended a temporary integration order that would compel cooperation in the interest of public safety. Homelander asked whether compulsion would play well on camera, and Ashley replied that relevance was a prerequisite for optics. A train, watching the feed from the yard, commented that the man did not appear to understand why anyone was filming him. While the integration order was being reviewed, a secondary alert triggered at a hospital where backup generators had failed to synchronize with the grid, trapping surgical teams mid-procedure. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to reestablish a familiar sequence, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that no longer obeyed its lights. The liaison authorized federal support for the hospital response, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the market he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a gurney stuck between elevator doors that had stalled between floors. He asked if they needed help and pried the doors apart enough to free the wheels without comment, and the generator's hum steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The surgical team moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized the integration order as an emergency measure that would take effect immediately, and the liaison transmitted the documentation to field teams with instructions to make contact. The analytics dashboard updated with a sixth clip that could not be attributed to branding, and the sentiment curve dipped again. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a nurse pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. The emergency integration order was never meant to be public, but the transmission leaked within minutes of being routed to field teams, and by the time Vought's legal department realized what had happened, the language compelling an unaffiliated civilian to cooperate in the interest of public safety had already reached national networks. Analysts attempted to frame the order as a procedural safeguard, while commentators asked whether it implied that the Seven could not manage without assistance, and the question traveled faster than any clarification. Ashley authorized a damage control segment that would emphasize the scale of the day's incidents, but the accompanying footage did not show escalation so much as repetition, because each crisis had been resolved before the heroes had arrived to lead it. Homelander watched the hospital clip on a loop and asked whether leadership could be measured by who arrived second. International affiliates began requesting guidance when a bridge collapse in Toronto triggered a response that local heroes found partially completed by a man matching Saitama's description, and a lab in Berlin reported that a chemical spill had been contained by someone who declined to give a name. Vought's European branch flagged the correlation as coincidental, until a port authority in Tokyo transmitted footage of a container yard rescue that featured the same yellow suit moving a stack of steel as if it were a door. The global dashboard populated with incidents that did not align with deployment schedules, and the analytics team reported that the sentiment dip had begun to spread beyond domestic markets. A train asked whether the man was traveling, and Maeve replied that the timestamps suggested otherwise. Back in Manhattan, a high-rise fire triggered an evacuation that routed the response to the Seven with priority status, and Maeve coordinated with first responders to secure stairwells that had begun to fill with smoke. A train cleared a path through traffic that had entered a fallback mode when the grid failed to synchronize, and Homelander departed with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to reassert control on a visible stage. The wind shifted as the first ladder reached the 10th floor, and a line of residents pressed against a landing that had not been designed for that volume. Saitama arrived because the route he had taken toward an open market ran past the building, and he paused when he saw a child struggling to carry a pet carrier down a stairwell that had tilted under the heat. He asked if they needed help and lifted the frame enough to clear the obstruction without comment, and the landing settled back into place with a sound that did not match the force applied. The crowd's attention shifted again, and the phones that had been pointed toward the flames did not turn away when Homelander landed behind him. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as international networks cut to a compilation of unaffiliated rescues that could not be attributed to Vought, and legal requested an injunction to prevent further dissemination. The federal liaison advised that the integration order might now be interpreted as an admission of dependence, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system. The analytics team reported a further dip in sentiment across multiple markets, and the word overnight appeared in headlines that legal could not challenge. While the fire was brought under control, a secondary alert triggered at a transit hub where a power failure had stalled trains between stations, and the evacuation routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that no longer obeyed its lights. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the market he had tried next was also closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a group of commuters trying to pry open a jammed carriage door. He asked if they needed help and pulled it free enough to clear the platform without comment, and the emergency lighting steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The commuters moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a global advisory that would redefine leadership as facilitation, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again, as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended a review of deployment protocols. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a transit worker pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. By early evening, the integration order had become less about cooperation and more about assertion, because the 6th independent save in as many hours had forced Vought to confront a public narrative that no longer waited for branded leadership to arrive. The federal liaison recommended a live demonstration of coordination that would place Saitama within a controlled response environment, and Ashley authorized a staged deployment that would emphasize shared authority. Homelander agreed to the optics on the condition that the scenario be framed as a joint rescue, while Maeve asked whether staging a crisis would be distinguishable from the ones already happening. A-Train noted that the public did not appear to care who initiated the save as long as it was completed. The opportunity presented itself when a cargo plane reported a landing gear failure on approach, and the emergency routing brought the situation within range of both Vought's air response and federal oversight. Homelander launched with the expectation that this would be a visible reassertion of control, and Maeve coordinated with ground crews to clear the runway while A-Train secured the perimeter. The liaison requested that Saitama be transported to the site under the authority of the integration order, and a field team located him in a convenience store comparing instant noodles with a concentration that suggested the choice mattered more than the sirens outside. When informed that his assistance was required, Saitama asked whether it would take long because the sale on eggs ended at 8. At the runway, the plane's approach had become unstable as the damaged gear dragged against the tarmac, and the pilot's voice carried a strain that no broadcast could smooth. Homelander met the fuselage with practiced precision, bracing against a wing that shuddered under the load while ground crews signaled for distance. Maeve moved to support the tail section, and A-Train reported that the perimeter was losing cohesion as bystanders pushed for a view. The cameras framed the save as it had always been framed, until the field team arrived with Saitama stepping out of a transport that had been intended for equipment. He asked where he should stand and was directed toward a position near the nose, because the liaison believed proximity would imply participation. When the damaged gear caught and the fuselage lurched, Saitama placed a hand against the forward section to steady it, and the vibration that had been traveling through the frame ceased without transitioning through any measurable reduction. Homelander felt the change in load before the sensors did, and the wing that had resisted him a moment ago settled into a position that required less effort than it had to maintain. Maeve glanced toward the nose and saw the same man who had lifted a support beam earlier that day. The plane touched down without further incident, and the applause that followed was diffuse because the cameras could not decide where to rest. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a staged response, and Legal began drafting language that would define participation as leadership. The federal liaison requested confirmation that the integration order had been fulfilled, and Homelander thanked Saitama for the assistance with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Back at the tower, the analytics dashboard updated with a sentiment curve that dipped below any threshold previously associated with resilience, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder in future incidents. The mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected towards someone outside the system, and the liaison recommended a review of deployment protocols. Saitama asked whether he could leave because the store would be closing soon, and a crew chief pointed toward the exit that would take him away from the cameras. The runway demonstration had been designed to restore sequence, but the footage that reached the public instead reinforced a pattern that no amount of staging could disguise, because the moment that stabilized the landing was not tied to a branded arrival, but to a hand placed casually against a fuselage. Vought's communications team attempted to crop the frame in post-production, yet the original feeds had already circulated with angles that showed Homelander bracing against a wing that stopped trembling only after Saitama touched the nose. Analysts began to note that applause in the background did not rise when the landing gear cleared the tarmac, but when the vibration ceased, and the distinction mattered in a way that sentiment curves translated into risk. Ashley authorized a coordinated interview that would place Saitama beside the Seven, while Legal prepared language that defined proximity as affiliation. Saitama did not attend the interview because he had gone to the store the crew chief had mentioned, and the field team that located him again reported that he was comparing discounts with a focus that suggested the decision carried more urgency than the day's incidents. When informed that his presence was requested for a live segment, he asked whether it would take long because he still needed to cook. The liaison assured him that it would be brief, and a transport was dispatched with instructions to route around a traffic grid that had not fully recovered from the earlier outages. A train noted that the route would intersect with a construction site where a crane had stalled under a load it could not lower. The stall had triggered a partial evacuation when the boom locked over an occupied street, and Maeve coordinated with site engineers to establish a perimeter, while ground crews attempted to reset the controls. The suspended load swayed as wind moved between buildings, and the crowd that had gathered pressed against barriers that were not designed for spectators. Homelander arrived with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to reassert control in a setting that cameras could frame, and the brand overlay prepared to track the save in real time. Saitama arrived because the transport had been rerouted through the site, and he paused when he saw a worker trying to guide a trapped colleague away from a support that had begun to buckle under the suspended weight. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, placing a hand against the beam to keep it from shifting further. The boom's sway dampened in a way the wind could not explain, and the engineer at the controls reported that the load had steadied without a corresponding change in tension. Maeve glanced toward the support and saw the same man who had steadied a plane hours earlier. Homelander moved to secure the area with a calm that had always translated into command, and thanked Saitama for assisting before instructing the crowd to move back. The cameras followed the instruction and then drifted toward the man who had already stepped away to ask whether the interview would still happen. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as the live feed favored an unaffiliated presence within a coordinated response, and Legal revised the interview format to include a panel discussion on shared leadership. Back at the tower, the analytics dashboard updated with a sentiment curve that no longer responded to ad placement, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder in future incidents. The federal liaison recommended a review of deployment protocols that would prioritize proximity over branding, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected accordingly. A train watched the crane footage and noted that the man did not appear to understand why anyone was filming him. While the panel was being assembled, a secondary alert triggered at a water treatment facility, where a valve failure threatened to flood a low-lying district, and the response routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transport had been rerouted again, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to close a manual gate that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the water level steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The technicians moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a revised messaging package that would redefine leadership as facilitation, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an immediate policy update. Saitama asked whether the interview would still happen, and a technician pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. The policy update was circulated with language that replaced leadership with facilitation, because the 8th independent intervention had made it impossible to claim that the 7 were arriving first even when the response had been routed through them. Affiliates requested permission to defer to proximity rather than branding, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be reallocated toward whoever happened to be closest when something went wrong. Ashley authorized a task force to evaluate deployment protocols in light of public sentiment, while Legal prepared an advisory that would frame the change as an evolution rather than a concession. Homelander reviewed the crane and water facility footage and asked whether evolution had ever meant stepping aside. The escalation that followed did not begin with a villain, but with a failure that could not be localized when a coastal refinery reported a pressure anomaly across multiple units simultaneously. The alert routed through federal oversight with a hazard classification that triggered national coordination, and the response plan assumed that Vought's air assets would establish control before containment teams arrived. Maeve moved to secure evacuation corridors, while A-Train cleared a path for emergency vehicles through a highway system that had begun to desynchronize under conflicting signals. The wind shifted as the first relief valves engaged, and the plume that rose carried a classification that no camera could soften. Saitama arrived because the transit route he had taken toward an open market intersected with the refinery's perimeter, and he paused when he saw a technician trying to free a coworker from a ladder that had warped under heat. He asked if they needed help and stepped forward when someone nodded, lifting the frame enough to clear the man's leg without comment. The pressure gauge nearest them dropped into a range the engineer would later say should not have been reachable without venting, and the hiss that had filled the unit softened as if the system had decided to wait. When Homelander landed seconds later, the first person he saw was the same man stepping back to ask whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open. The Federal liaison watched the live feed from a command vehicle and noted that the anomaly had resolved before the relief valves completed their cycle, and the task force updated its model to include unaffiliated intervention as a variable. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to footage that favored an independent presence within a federal response, and legal began drafting language that would redefine assistance as operational leadership. Maeve reported that the evacuation was holding, but the residents' phones remained pointed at someone who had already turned away from the plume. Back in the tower, the analytics dashboard registered a sentiment drop that correlated with each clip of Saitama acting independently, and affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer in similar scenarios. The mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected accordingly, and the liaison recommended an immediate review of jurisdiction. A train watched the refinery feed and noted that the man did not appear to understand why anyone was filming him. While the plume dissipated, a secondary alert triggered at a dam where a gate failure threatened to flood a downstream district, and the response routed to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transit route had been closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a maintenance crew struggling to engage a manual override that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the water level steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The crew moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a jurisdictional advisory that would redefine operational control in proximity terms, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an emergency council. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras. The emergency council convened with the assumption that jurisdiction could be preserved through clarification, yet the footage from the refinery and the dam suggested that control had already begun to migrate toward proximity rather than designation. Affiliates joined from international branches, where similar incidents had resolved before branded heroes could establish command, and the liaison presented a model that treated unaffiliated intervention as a stabilizing factor rather than an outlier. Ashley authorized a provisional directive that would allow municipal teams to coordinate with whoever arrived first, while legal prepared language that framed the shift as adaptive resilience. Homelander listened to the briefing and asked whether resilience had ever required stepping out of frame. A third escalation arrived when a communications satellite began to drift from its assigned orbit after a propulsion fault that could not be corrected remotely, and the alert routed through federal oversight with a classification that triggered national coordination. The response plan assumed that Vought's aerospace assets would establish control before the satellite intersected with a populated corridor, and Maeve coordinated with ground crews to clear potential impact zones. A train secured evacuation routes through traffic that had only just returned to normal operation, and the liaison requested confirmation that the provisional directive would apply beyond municipal boundaries. Saitama arrived because the street he had taken toward an open market passed beneath a parking structure where a support beam had cracked during the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a family trying to move a car that had rolled into the gap. He asked if they needed help and lifted the frame enough to clear the obstruction without comment, and the beam settled back into place with a sound that did not match the force applied. The crowd's attention shifted again, and the phones that had been pointed toward the sky did not turn away when Homelander descended nearby. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction to prevent further dissemination. The federal liaison advised that the provisional directive might now be interpreted as an admission of dependence, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected accordingly. The analytics team reported a further dip in sentiment across multiple markets, and the word irrelevant appeared in headlines that legal could not challenge. While the parking structure was secured, a secondary alert triggered at a coastal shipping lane where a container vessel had lost steering and was drifting toward a crowded pier, and the response rooted to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transit route had been closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a dockworker struggling to release a mooring line that had jammed under tension. He asked if they needed help and pulled it free without comment, and the vessel's drift slowed as if the load had been redistributed. The dockworkers moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a revised directive that would redefine operational leadership in proximity terms across federal responses, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an immediate policy update. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a crew chief pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras. The revised directive did not wait for ratification before it began to alter behavior, because municipal teams in multiple cities had already started coordinating with whoever arrived first rather than who had been deployed. Affiliates reported that response times improved when branding was treated as secondary, and the federal liaison presented a model that showed stabilization correlating with proximity rather than designation. Ashley authorized a temporary suspension of arrival protocols in favor of situational leadership, while legal prepared a statement that would frame the shift as an innovation in public safety. Homelander reviewed the policy and asked whether innovation had ever meant relinquishing control. The escalation that followed arrived from a hydroelectric facility where a turbine failure had triggered a cascade that threatened to flood a downstream valley, and the alert rooted through national coordination with a hazard classification that no camera could soften. Maeve moved to secure evacuation corridors, while A-Train cleared a path for emergency vehicles through a highway system that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison requested confirmation that the provisional directive would apply to infrastructure responses, and Ashley authorized its extension. Saitama arrived because the road he had taken toward an open market passed beneath a pedestrian bridge where a support had cracked during the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a group of commuters trying to move a barrier that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it aside without comment, and the bridge settled back into place with a sound that did not match the force applied. The crowd's attention shifted again, and the phones that had been pointed toward the valley did not turn away when Homelander descended nearby. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction to prevent further dissemination. The federal liaison advised that the suspension of arrival protocols might now be interpreted as an admission of dependence, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected accordingly. The analytics team reported a further dip in sentiment across multiple markets, and the word overnight appeared in headlines that legal could not challenge. While the turbine was brought under control, a secondary alert triggered at a metropolitan transit hub where a power failure had stalled trains between stations, and the response rooted to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transit route had been closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a maintenance crew struggling to engage a manual override that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the emergency lighting steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The crew moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a jurisdictional advisory that would redefine operational leadership across national responses, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve dipped again as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an emergency review. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a road that would take him away from the cameras. By the time the emergency review concluded, the shift had already occurred in practice, because municipal teams across multiple jurisdictions had begun coordinating with whoever arrived first rather than waiting for branded deployment to establish authority. Affiliates reported that response times improved when proximity was treated as leadership, and the federal liaison presented a final model that showed stabilization correlating with unaffiliated intervention across infrastructure, transit, and industrial incidents. Ashley authorized a permanent revision of arrival protocols in favor of situational command, while legal prepared a statement that would frame the change as an adaptive evolution in public safety. Homelander reviewed the language and asked whether evolution had ever required stepping aside. The last escalation arrived from a metropolitan hospital, where a grid failure had stalled life support systems between power cycles, and the alert rooted through national coordination with a hazard classification that could not be softened for broadcast. Maeve moved to secure evacuation corridors, while A-Train cleared a path for emergency vehicles through an intersection that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison requested confirmation that the revised protocols would apply to medical responses, and Ashley authorized their extension without waiting for a vote. Saitama arrived because the road he had taken toward an open market passed beneath the hospital's emergency entrance, and he paused when he saw a technician trying to free a generator housing that had jammed under pressure. He asked if they needed help and shifted it into place without comment, and the hum of backup power steadied as if the load had been redistributed. The surgical team moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley's earpiece filled with alerts as national networks cut to a compilation of independent interventions that could not be attributed to branding, and legal requested an injunction that would now arrive too late to matter. The federal liaison advised that the permanent revision might be interpreted as an admission that the 7 were no longer required to initiate response, and the mayor's office asked whether city resources should be redirected accordingly. The analytics team reported a sentiment curve that had flattened into a plateau beyond recovery. While the hospital stabilized, a secondary alert triggered at a communications hub where a signal relay had failed during the outage, and the response rooted to both municipal and federal oversight. Maeve redirected with the expectation that this would be an opportunity to demonstrate coordination, and A-Train moved to secure the route through traffic that had only just returned to normal operation. The liaison authorized additional support, and the command vehicle began to reposition. Saitama arrived because the transit route had been closed by the evacuation, and he paused when he saw a technician struggling to reseat a relay that had slipped under load. He asked if they needed help and pushed it into place without comment, and the signal steadied as if the system had decided to wait. The technicians moved past him without looking up, and the cameras that had followed the convoy lingered longer than they had intended. Ashley authorized a final directive that would redefine operational leadership across national responses in proximity terms, and the analytics dashboard updated with another clip that could not be attributed to branding. The sentiment curve remained flat as affiliates requested guidance on whether their own heroes should defer to an unaffiliated responder, and the liaison recommended an immediate implementation. Saitama asked whether any stores outside the perimeter might still be open, and a technician pointed toward a street that would take him away from the cameras. Behind him, the revised protocols remained in place, and the heroes who had once arrived first now waited for instructions that would be issued only after someone else had already begun. The world did not return to normal, because leadership had been redefined in a way that no longer required the Seven to lead, and relevance had shifted overnight to whoever happened to be there when something went wrong.